Thank you. Right, it's a very sensitive button, this, so I better be careful only to press it when I intend to. As you can see from that, I'm the director of the new Third Sector Research Centre, based at the University of Birmingham, although we also operate from the University of Southampton. We're an academic research centre, and I stand here before you as an academic. On occasions like this, I'm reminded of the old joke, what do you get when you cross an academic with a member of the mafia? You get an offer you can't understand. Well, hopefully, having heard the joke before, I've learned that at the very least you'll understand what I say. However, as an academic, I want to ask some questions, and in some ways I want to treat the issue of why third sector quality matters to policymakers as a research question. And I want to do that by taking a research perspective and asking, from our perspective as a research centre, why we think this is an important question and why it may not be such a simple question to answer. And it's a question that I suppose I should honestly say we don't have a simple answer to at the moment, partly because it's relatively early days for the work of the research centre, and partly I think to some extent mapping out the different parameters of this question, as you'll see, is something that requires us to reflect a little on why we're asking the question. And I want to do that, first of all, by setting this in a little bit of context, by looking at the recent development of the policy environment and some of the changing nature of relationships, in particular between the sector and the state and government. There's general agreement, I think, certainly amongst those commentating on the policy environment, that in the last decade or so there's been what a colleague of mine, Jeremy Kendall, described as a step change in the policy environment affecting the third sector. Step change which has raised the profile of the third sector in the policy world and put the third sector at the centre of what some people have talked about as the third way, which has characterised policy in particular since the election of the Labour government in the late 1990s. There's an awful lot of thirds in this, third sectors and third ways, and I know that the notion of the third sector itself is not a descriptor that's necessarily welcomed by a wide range of organisations operating within it. I've addressed a number of conferences where people have said, no, we're not the third sector, we're the first. Why do they keep relegating us to the third? And But it's a term that is widely used, one which I intend to use, although one which we will problematise more generally in our research. If you can characterise that step change in one particular word, I think you can characterise it by the word partnership, and an expectation that the relationship between the third sector and government is now one of partnership. And a partnership, therefore, which has expectations of both parties to that partnership, things that government will do with and for the third sector, and things that it expects and that the third sector is expected to do with and for its relationship with government. And in part, you can see the changing nature of government relationships with the centre in a shift to, again, quoting a colleague of mine, Jeremy Kendall, a shift from what he called vertical to horizontal support. Instead of government policy focusing on particular areas of activity, health and social care, education, arts and leisure, increasingly government policy is focused on providing support across the board to third sector activity more generally, and to look at ways in which different aspects of third sector activity, of which quality is one, can be supported and promoted by government action. So I think there's been a shift towards a new relationship, and it's a relationship which is about how third sector organisations operate as much as what it is that they do. And of course, central to that has been the creation of a new organisation, a new department within government, the Office of the Third Sector, part of the Cabinet Office at the centre of government, whose responsibility it is to manage, promote and support those relationships with the third sector. And the higher profile of the OTS within government and its close relationships in particular with the Treasury are part of that rising profile for the third sector. And there's all sorts of examples of the kind of strategic support that is provided in part through OTS, through the development of a compact to govern relationships between the sector and the government, and through a series of investment programmes to help third sector organisations and their representatives better equip themselves to manage those partnership relationships. Future builders and capacity builders, I suspect there are people funded by or even providing funding from those organisations here with us today. There are a number of reasons why, of course, that strategic partnership is being developed and why those relationships are changing, but two of them in particular are at the forefront of policy thinking and indeed of policy practice. First of all, there's public service delivery and the increasing expectation that the third sector should play an important and indeed an essential role in the delivery of public services. and also expectations around civic renewal, around the role that the third sector plays in promoting in promoting effective social relationships more generally. So there is a policy agenda and a series of policy levers through a department now at the centre of government. With that, therefore, comes increasing use of public funding to support the third sector and to support organisations operating within it. Public funding has been growing as a source of income for the sector over recent years, and currently, according to the NCVO's National Almanac, and this is the NCVO data applies to England only. I'm primarily talking about an English policy context here, although it's important to remember that there are similar developments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. As a source of income, public funding is around 31% now of the income for third sector organisations. Although it's worth remembering, although that's a high proportion, it still only applies to around a quarter of voluntary organisations or third sector organisations. 75% of charities receive no public funding. There's also been a shift in the balance of funding from grant-related funding to contract-related funding. It's an interesting shift, actually, at least if you look at the data provided in the NCV Almanac, because that's not a product of a decline in the number or scale of grants available. It's mainly a product of the expansion of contract funding. Contract funding has shifted from the relationship has shifted from around 50-50, 1-to-1, to around 2-to-1, 30-60, with contracts now becoming the major form of funding. And of course, with that changed funding environment have come a series of procedures that accompany contractual funding: procurement, commissioning, monitoring and evaluation, and of course the introduction of a more competitive funding environment. Part of the requirements for contracting and commissioning are procurement regulations, and certainly a set of procurement regulations largely determined legally by the European Union and by other government regulations, which require competitive environment for funding. So we're entering into a world in which there's increased public funding, but it comes increasingly with strings, conditions, regulations and requirements attached. And part of the consequence for that, therefore, is the expectation that those organisations seeking support within this new strategic partnership will be required and expected to demonstrate that they provide quality services, that the quality of their activities justifies the resources that they're getting. At the end of the day, of course, public funding is taxpayers' money. Taxpayers have a right to expect that their money is being spent on providing quality goods. So commissioners increasingly expect proof of organisational quality, evidenced through monitoring and evaluation. And that applies increasingly to grant funding as well as contract funding. The idea that Helen was quoting earlier of just wandering into the CEO's office in your dungarees and saying we need a bit more money, even for grant funding, it's frequently not the case that grants are awarded on such an open basis. Quality, therefore, has been at the centre of that increasingly has been at the centre of that new funding environment.